Hey everyone, welcome to SingularityComputers Client Build 9, Part 4. In this part of the build log, I'm going to complete the mods. I'm then going to install all of the hardware, including the water cooling system, and fill the loop. So at the end of this part of the build log, all I'll have left to do is the wiring and the lighting. I'm now going to get started with the installation of two vandal switches, one for the power button and one for the lighting. So I have here a 22mm ModSmart white ring vandal switch and a 22mm Bolgen white dot vandal switch. The white ring vandal switch is a momentary switch. So it basically momentarily closes a circuit, and it's designed for a power button or reset button. The white dot vandal switch is a latching switch. So it holds a circuit open or shut. It's designed for lighting or anything that needs to be switched either on or off. There's a number of positions around the case where I can install the vandal switches. I think they'd look best on the front panel. In the center of the front panel, one on either side. Because they have white LEDs, they're just going to fit in perfectly. But one of the big requests for this build was extremely clean aesthetics, and you can see that in all of my mods so far. So I'm not going to go doing anything that can take from the clean aesthetics, and in particular I really don't want to go changing the front panel or top panel. But the biggest thing is the wiring. Wiring for vandal switches is really an absolute mess. It sticks out behind the vandal switch about 30mm, and usually I cover it up with heat shrink to try to clean things up. And you know, if you consider how far the wiring sticks out behind the vandal switches, it means that if I install them in the front panel, top panel, or bottom panel, the wiring is going to be highly visible. So this leaves the side panels or back panel. I definitely don't want to go installing them in the side panels because they obviously need to be disconnected to remove the side panels. So this leaves the back panel. And the best place to install them in the back panel is down low next to the power supply. That way the wiring is going to be hidden. It also means a nice short run for the wiring, so I can keep the wiring nice and clean. So I've drilled some holes in the back panel, and I'm now test fitting the vandal switches. I think they look good in this position, and for those of you who think that they're going to be difficult to access here, because the case is so small, it's not that difficult to reach around the back of the case. You can see how the wiring is going to be hidden here. With the side panels on, the wiring is going to be completely hidden. And even with the side panels off, the wiring is going to be almost completely hidden. So this is definitely the cleanest position in the build to install the vandal switches. Now I've been through a number of different configurations for the Seagate 4TB 3.5-inch hard drive I'm installing into the build. In the last part of the build log, I talked about why I decided not to use the hard drive silencer I was originally planning on using, and instead I decided to make up a custom hard drive enclosure. This is my new sheet metal bender. I actually picked this up during the Cosmonaut build, and it's just perfect for modding. It's perfect for what I do because it's 600 wide. It can bend up to, I think, 2mm aluminium, which is enough for what I'm doing. Usually I use 1.5mm aluminium, and I picked it up for just over $100 new, to give you an idea. And with something like this, you have an incredible amount of freedom. There is just so much you can do. Now this is only one of the designs that I came up with for the custom hard drive enclosure, and this is actually not finished. I designed this to fit onto the back panel, and the problem was it was going to infringe on the inlet and outlet of the radiator on the top panel. And it would still have fit if I had have turned the radiator on the top panel around the other way, which would have required rebuilding the top panel. So I decided not to go ahead with that design. I spent a lot of time on this. I went through a bunch of different designs. I'm actually going to come back to the 3.5-inch hard drive. I'm now cutting some M4 button head Allen key bolts. I'm shortening them. I have a massive collection of different bolts, but every now and then I come across a situation where I don't have bolts that are the correct size. Now I have a technique I use when shortening bolts. The biggest problem when cutting bolts is that you destroy the thread, and you know, the bolts become unusable. What I do is screw a nut onto the bolt down to the level I cut at. Then I cut up against the nut And when you screw the nut off, the thread is being preserved because the nut, surrounds the thread, holds it all together, and prevents any damage. You also need to make sure you get a really clean cut, otherwise it doesn't work. Okay, I'm now going to complete the painting. These are the spaces that are going to go between the acrylic cover panels for the fans and the front and top panel. So I've sprayed them with an etch primer, and it's now time to spray them with top coat. I'm going to paint these and also the rest of the panels that need to be painted all at the same time. I've now completed all of the case mods and I've prepared the case for painting. You can see that I've removed the motherboard tray. Now, I still could have painted the case with the motherboard tray installed. I could have got into the tight spots by painting in on angles, but it's going to be a lot easier to paint with the motherboard tray removed. It means I can get better coverage and a better quality finish. So it's something you need to consider. Is it easier to, disassemble what you're going to be painting, or is it easier to try to get into those tight spots? And I can tell you it took minutes to remove the motherboard tray, to drill out a few rivets, and it will also take minutes to reinstall it. So a lot of the time it is definitely better to disassemble what you're going to be painting. So the paint I'm using here is a midnight black satin, and it's a lacquer. I'm not going to talk about my spray setup because I talked about that in the last part of the build log. I'm now going back to the assembly of the case and components. I've already installed the fans and radiators onto the front and top panel. I'm now going to install the pump and reservoir configuration onto the back of the front radiator. And I'm going to use a technique I often use in my builds. I have here two UNZ2 120mm brackets and two bits power 60mm reservoir mounts. I often talk about UN mounts in my videos, how incredibly versatile and useful they are. This would have to be the most versatile UN mount and the one I use most often. It's designed for mounting components onto radiators, in particular water cooling components, but you can mount almost any components onto any 120mm or 140mm fan mounting position, because there's also a 140mm option. Now there is a little problem with this particular configuration. The pump and res config is often too heavy for the res mounts. So it slides down through the res mounts, and this problem gets worse obviously when you fill the loop. There is a number of ways of dealing with this problem. I mean, there's so many different configurations you can go for. I've used these brackets to mount dual pumps, dual reservoirs onto radiators that are mounted horizontally and vertically. The possibilities are just endless. Now, how I'm going to deal with this problem with this particular configuration in this build, when you're using hard tubing, you can actually design the tubing and fittings to hold the pump and res config in position to support it. I've now finished all of the painting, so I've painted the spaces and the case, and I've installed the acrylic cover panels over the fans. So the front and top panels are fully assembled and ready to be installed. But as I talked about in the last part of the build log, I've designed the case mods so that I can do almost all of the assembly and installations, basically build the entire system before installing the front and top panel. This obviously gives me better access inside of the case and makes assembly and disassembly a whole lot quicker and easier. It will also make future maintenance easier. So you'll see that I install the front and top panel as late as possible. I've riveted the motherboard tray back into position and I've started installing the first of the components. In a build that involves extensive mods, installing the first of the components is often a massive step. I mean, sometimes I've been working for weeks, even months, on case mods, and once you start installing the components, things move a lot more quickly, because a lot of the mods take a massive amount of time, and there's not much payoff. It doesn't look like much work has been done. And that's where making these build log videos can be really challenging for me, and that's why there's such big gaps between them. Because obviously I need to do a certain amount of work to be able to make a video. And sometimes, mainly in the early stages, I have to work for 3 weeks just to be able to make a video. So I've now installed the motherboard, and I was actually planning on doing another mod to the motherboard where I was going to cover the motherboard with smoked acrylic, or as much of the motherboard as I could. And I actually decided not to do this at the last minute because this is a great looking motherboard and it's not really visible. You know, once the system is fully assembled, you can only see the motherboard on a very sharp angle. So if I were to go to all of that effort to cover it up with smoked acrylic, you know, I was going to leave the vitals exposed, the heat sinks, CPU water block, and the ports and slots I needed access to, obviously, but I just think it wouldn't really be visible anyway. So I've installed vinyl on the graphics card backplate. It was just an easy and obvious place to install vinyl, and I wanted more vinyl on the inside of the build to match up with the amount that's on the outside of the build. And I still may install more vinyl at this point. Going back to the hard drive, I've decided to go back to the original decision I made when I was actually coming up with the ideas for this build, which is to use a 2.5 inch hard drive instead of a 3.5 inch hard drive. And I've decided this because of what I've been saying about this hard drive all along. It's just going to really take from the aesthetics and clutter the build. And this is the final design I came up with for a hard drive enclosure. It's actually not finished. When I build these kinds of things, when I'm modding, I usually build a prototype to start with. That way I can quickly build it, play around with the design, just build something really rough, and then, you know, I can do it properly for the final product. The case is now fully assembled, and I've also installed most of the components. I'm really happy with the way this design has turned out. Originally, I was actually thinking about leaving the fans completely exposed on the front panel. And the reason I wanted to do that is because these are amazing looking fans. I wanted to make them a feature, and I also wanted black and white to be really obvious on the outside of the case because that is the color scheme for this build. But as I've mentioned, one of the biggest requests for this build is extremely clean aesthetics, and I was actually going to do something completely different on the top panel. I was going to use mesh or something similar. So the obvious next step was to cover up the fans somehow to clean up the aesthetics as much as possible. So I came up with the idea of these cover panels, and initially the only question was, you know, was I going to follow the curved design underneath with the cover panels? And also I wasn't sure about the gap that I was going to use for ventilation. And I decided on the rectangular panel with a 10mm gap, which I think is plenty for ventilation. And I also decided to obviously copy the design of the front panel on the top panel, the only difference being I've pushed it towards the back of the case. So I've used the exact same measurements on the top panel as I have on the front panel. So that was basically my train of thought for the case mods. It's now time to build the loop. I have my Bits Power fittings collection here ready to go. My entire Bits Power fittings collection is black sparkle fittings. As most of you will know, my favorite fittings are Bits Power Black Sparkle, and I really think that they fit almost any color scheme. I've now almost completed the water cooling loop. There's just one more section I still need to build. Recently there's been some exciting developments in water cooling when it comes to acrylic tube. Bits Power were really the ones who started it, and Primo Chill has now released an acrylic tube system. EK has also released a new acrylic tube system. So coming up, I'm going to dedicate a video to acrylic tube. The fittings, the acrylic tube, you know, all of the different options that are out there, also how to bend acrylic tube and how to cut it. And I think this is a really important development in water cooling. I have talked about this in a previous video. I don't think this is just a trend that's going to come and go. I think this is an evolution in water cooling that is going to continue to be developed. And I'm looking forward to new products being released. I hope that Bits Power upgrades their acrylic tube system coming up. So I've now completed the water cooling loop. The last thing I always do is install the drainage system. And I often actually complete my water cooling loops. So I build the entire loop, close the loop, and then I go back and change a section of the loop and add a drainage system. And I just find this is the best way to get a properly designed drainage system in the best possible position. It just helps to visualize it and come up with ideas, because it can often be really difficult to add a drainage system, mainly in a small form factor build like this, and most importantly without making it look really cluttered and ugly, because a drainage system is something that's not going to be used that often. If you can build an amazing looking drainage system, it's not so bad, or if you can actually turn it into a feature, like what I did in client build 10 for example. I'll put a link on the screen to the build log, and fittings like this really help with that. This bits power tap for example is an amazing looking component. But actually my opinion of drainage systems has changed because of recent developments in water cooling. Coolant is lasting a whole lot longer now. I mean, Mayhem's Pastel coolant lasts for up to 3 years in the loop, and I think it will last even longer because a lot of people are building loops from acrylic tube now. And I've talked about in previous videos how acrylic tube can make your coolant last longer. And that's something I'll cover in detail again coming up in my acrylic tube video. So it just makes drainage systems more and more useless when you consider that they're only going to be used once in the lifetime of a build. I mean, there's not many people that are going to use a system, a high-end water-cooled system, beyond 3 years without upgrading any component. So a lot of the time you're better off just not installing a drainage system and instead just putting a container under one of the fittings and undoing it and draining the loop that way. I mean, as long as you consider that when you're building your loop, if you consider have a part of your loop that you're going to use to drain the loop, but not build a drainage system, that's actually the way I used to do things in the old days when there was minimal fittings. We certainly didn't have any components such as the bits power tap, and there was also no quick disconnects or anything like that. So I used to just build a part of the loop so that I could get a container in there and undo a fitting. So as you can see, I have everything set up and ready to go to fill the loop. I've covered the precautions you need to take against leaks many times in previous videos, so I'm not going to cover that in this build log. I will say that my favorite precaution against leaks is definitely having your drainage system hooked up and ready to go, because there's nothing like getting a fast leak and having no way of draining your loop. You pretty much just have to sit there and look at it. Now I'm actually going to give you a listen to the loop being filled this time. I always show the process of filling the loop in my build logs, and the reason for that is I've had a lot of people say that that's their favorite part of a build log for a water-cooled system. So I had to switch the pump on and off 3 times before the coolant was circulating, and what that really comes down to is the volume of your reservoir compared to the volume of your loop, as well as some other aspects of the loop design. In the end, it took about probably 10 minutes before I had the loop up and running. So the loop is full and up and running, and it's now time for the leak test. I've completed the leak test, and something that I get a lot of requests for now is for me to cover every single fitting I've used in my loops. And this is something I used to do, but I stopped doing it because it really takes a lot of time to go through all of the fittings. But for this build, because it is a smaller loop, in the next part of the build log, I'll take a far more detailed look around the system when the system is complete and at the water cooling loop, and I'll cover all of the fittings. So there's obviously a lot more black than white in the build, and that's definitely the way I wanted things, because when there's more white than black, the white becomes overbearing and just washes out the color scheme. But with more black than white, it really helps the white to stand out. And Mayhem's Pastel is just such a pure white, and what I'm going to do is install white lighting, and it's going to make the coolant glow a really bright white. And You have to keep in mind that the front panel is smoked acrylic, so it's transparent. Once I install white lighting, you're actually going to be able to see the internal components through the front panel. So the build may look really black now. Also keep in mind that I'm still going to install the white cables. So I think that's going to balance things out in combination with the lighting. I mean, the white fans almost look black through the smoked acrylic, but that's also going to change with some well-placed lighting. Anyway, that sums up this part of the build log. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.